The Fabfilter ProQ3 EQ plugin was released on the 29th of November 2018, so it's by now 5 years old and is pretty much still the EQ king or queen where all other EQs are compared to. The TBTech Kirchoff EQ, which is now available via Plugin Alliance, aims to take the crown. But is the Kirchhoff EQ really better than Fabfilter's ProQ3? My first impression of the Kirchhoff EQ was that TBTech took a good look at Fabfilter's plugin and took another good look and another good look and then decided to not make a one-on-one copy, but not before taking another good look. Now the Kirchhoff has basically every function of the ProQ3 and added a bucket load of additional curves, settings and more on top of that. The most notable addition in regards of EQ is that it has, besides clean EQ like the ProQ3, a whole range of all sorts of emulated analog EQs, from Natve style to SSL and many more. That's pretty sweet to have. Now what I don't like is that when you have selected for instance a clean bell EQ, you don't default to the analog equivalent of for instance a Natve bell, but you have to make sure you select the right one. That's one extra step to do. I wish that Fabfilter will add different types of EQ sounds to the next iteration of ProQ. It doesn't have to be based on classic EQs like the Kirchhoff, but with added saturation for instance. Fabfilter has some catching up to do in this regard. The Kirchhoff EQ does something very smart with its EQ, and that is, in stereo left-right mode, you can pan the EQ band, not just left or right or mid or side panning. This is very handy with EQ fixing tasks or subtle boosts in stereo tracks. This is something which is missed on ProQ3. Kirchhoff boasts on their own website on how much cleaner their EQ is in comparison with ProQ3, and that is true. The Kirchhoff is very clean and the ProQ3 has a noise floor. But you have to see that in perspective. The noise floor on ProQ3 is for the most part below minus 165 decibel. 24-bit audio has a dynamic range of 144 decibels. 16-bit audio has a dynamic range of 96 decibels. This means that the noise floor of ProQ3 is way below the audible range for humans. Even if you would boost a very soft signal with ProQ3, this noise won't be anywhere near hearable range. The noise of the audio itself will be louder anyway. So in practice, clean sound for both. You made it so far in the video, make sure to subscribe to this channel to stay up to date on the latest new cool plugins. This video is made possible by DistroKid. Cover songs is probably one of the many types of songs you would love to do, but uploading to a streaming platforms is always a hassle due to copyrights and required fee because you cover an original song. DistroKid makes this very easy for you by offering the option to do this all for you for $12 per song per year when you have a DistroKid subscription. Use my link in the description to get 7% off of your first year on DistroKid. Do you need all the bells and whistles of the Kirchhoff? Well, that utterly depends on your workflow. My brain works like this. I pick a clean EQ to fix issues with an audio track. I will most likely use ProQ3. Then I do my dynamics and use an EQ to polish the sound. That is most likely a coloring EQ like the a.k.a. 200 or ProQ3 again. I want those separate steps for my own clarity of mind. So for me, having all these options within one plugin is not something I want. But I do see the added value of having these multiple emulated analog EQs in one plugin. And having these options might be excellent for your workflow. With ProQ3, Fabfilter introduced dynamic EQs to the plugin. Fabfilter is not the inventor of dynamic EQ, but I think it's safe to say that when dynamic EQ was introduced to ProQ3, the entire audio software industry rushed to get dynamic EQ into their own plugins. The dynamic EQ in ProQ3 is that simple to use. Just click and choose or drag here to activate. Use auto settings or set the threshold and be done. The Kirchhoff EQ also has dynamic EQ, which is far more advanced than in ProQ3, which allows for far more control. You can even do split EQ type of things where you focus on attack or sustain. Now, because this is far more advanced, this is also more complicated to set up. If you're more familiar with dialing in compressors, this is not difficult to do and will give you far more flexibility in EQ sculpting and problem fixing. In regards of overall interface design, the GUI, Fabfilter has always been absolute top-notch and very hard to beat. The Kirchhoff does not beat ProQ3 in its interface design. You can see that the text menus on the Kirchhoff are tiny. Too tiny for me on a 4K screen on Windows. The text uses a fixed amount of pixels regardless of which resolution you run. On smaller resolutions this will be less of an issue. In ProQ3 there's no issue, nice size for the menus. There are more things. If I resize the ProQ3, there's a limit on how small I can get, which leaves the EQ setting display readable at all times, and it nicely fades away when it gets even smaller to keep the frequency display nice and clear. On the Kirchhoff it's basically the same, unless you have the dynamic section or bottom bar folded out. Smaller sizes will overlap the menus. When running Windows at 150%, which is the recommended setting on 4K screens, you see that with the Kirchhoff, menus and text get a bit blurry. On the ProQ3 it's razor sharp. Also the Kirchhoff has a bit of a dated look to me. A bit 2000s Waves plugin type of look. In actual use, ProQ3 just works a bit better. Double clicking on a frequency point or on this dial will let you manually insert a frequency or note value. Very handy. On the Kirchhoff you can only do that here and here alone. Also no note values. Basically every main setting can be set manually in this small pop-up menu with the Fabfilter, which also allows for a very fast workflow. On the Kirchhoff you need to use the menu here, which is just a bit slower and more involved. So, which one to pick? Do you choose between if you want a clean EQ with sleek interface which gives you basically everything you need for fast workflow and proper EQing? Or do you want a clean EQ which allows you to go in depth and really dive in the very detail in EQ with a slight less awesome, more involved interface, but also gives you the option for colored EQs? Anyway, there are many EQs. Some EQs are so similar to another existing EQ you might wonder why they are created in the first place. I talk about that in the video which is displayed on screen and linked in the description below.